Okay, let's talk a little bit about the transfer portal. The spring window is open. How would you describe UF's strategy in the portal right now?
I think in general, whether it's the winter portal or the spring portal, and Florida will say this in general, like their strategy is to go a slower approach. And I know the fan base hates it. It's not always fun to cover it because as soon as the transfer portal window opens, the first day, everyone's like, Blake, who are we recruiting? Who are we targeting? What are we doing? What's going on? Why don't we have 27 names on the list right now? And it's just how they go. They go through their evaluation process. And I think that they've gotten better at maybe anticipating what guys could enter the portal, or you kind of hear through rumor mills that so and so could test the waters. And there's family members that can reach out to a school beforehand and kind of kick the tires to see, would you guys be interested in us? Where are we kind of at with you guys as far as potential and all those types of things. So I think that Florida strategy is going to be slower, but I also think in general, you compare the spring to the winter portal, it's apples to oranges. I mean, that winter portal, you see some of those really big names. It's really exciting. The period to enter the portal is longer in general anyways. It's just a 2-week portal there in the spring. So I feel like a lot of the rosters are already built by then. But
Mhm.
there are exceptions because you never know who could be leaving your team. You could be a new coaching staff that's trying to flip that roster or has to fill holes that you lost from guys you left through a coaching transition. So it depends. But if you're at a school like Florida where they entered that period there, they entered the 86 of 85 scholarship limits. So I think that should tell you you got to be a seller before you can be a buyer. So I think that that's where we've been kind of waiting for things there. And then you have Enoch Wagnoy, the 2025 offensive tackle commit, the 25 class. You lose Manny Nunnery, he drops you from 86 back to 85. You add Enoch back in the fold, 86 again. So
Right.
it's a spot where Florida did a lot of their damage as far as retooling the defensive backfield and all these other spots, offensive tackle. They did that in the winter period. So the needs weren't really quite there. So I feel like in general, it was going to be a slower window anyways on a school and its coaching staff that in general just moves a lot slower with their evaluations. And it's tough because you kind of have to go quick in the portal. If you're not the first visit, you may not get your visit. So
Right.
there are different ways to it. So I can understand both sides of it to where you want to make sure it's a right fit because I mean, even looking at this portal period right now, and it's just different teams around the country where I've seen guys that entered a school or entered the transfer portal, transfer to a school there in winter, and here they are back again in the spring period. So you always want to make sure that you're kind of doing your due diligence there. But there is the fact of moving slow in the sense to where you could miss out on some guys. You could move too slow there. Spots fill up really fast. So I just think the winter period in general isn't just or excuse me, the spring period in general just isn't exciting as the winter period. Florida entered this period anyways, really needing a wide receiver and anything else as far as maybe an interior offensive lineman. I think if the right edge player entered the portal and they could make the numbers work because they are crunching, I just feel like their options, or as far as their needs, I guess is best to say, were more limited compared to where it was there in December and January.
So if you had to say a position group that really we Florida absolutely needed to add during this window, to be ready for the upcoming fall season, would that be wide receiver? What position would that be for you?
For me, it's wide receiver easily. I think you look there. Um, Florida has Eugene Wilson, and even he's a sophomore, and he's probably your biggest play guy, a guy that that's going to really kind of set a fire on your offense. And past that, there's some guys that you've seen some flashes. I mean, you've seen, Jackson make some plays there. Khalil Jackson there makes some plays for Florida. That's a guy that was a former walk-on that's now got a scholarship. And granted, he has made the best of that in getting that scholarship, and he's made some plays this past season. But you get Chimere Dike, because I mispronounce his name all the time, the transfer from Wisconsin that's got those ties to Graham Mertz. But Florida was still recruiting guys at the wide receiver position, guys that they missed out on. Lost one to Florida State, lost one to LSU in those recruiting battles there. And I can't remember the exact target list off the top of my head, but those two stuck out. Those were guys that Florida was still trying to add there all the way up to the end of that portal window there in the winter. So I think that that's an area where they need to. You've got some guys that are really young. You've got some guys that may have a year in your program but are still unproven as far as what they're going to do in a game. And then you've got some older guys that really haven't had a lot of game experience either. So I think in general, that's an area where I think that Florida has needed to address just guys that can make an impact now. And I think ideally the winter period would have been where you really wanted to do that, but you still have that need that's carried over here into the spring period. And here we are still kind of on the lookout for what may be out there for Florida in that spring period.
So, they have an opportunity this weekend. They have Justice Ross Simmons coming in. Do you think Florida is in a good position there for him?
I do. I think that there's always some wait and see because this is a guy that hasn't visited Florida ever. Since he entered the portal, he's had a lot of schools that have reached out to him because, again, if you've got a guy that I think was pushing around 800 yards receiving this past season as a sophomore, 3 touchdowns, he played some there as a freshman. So
Yeah.
you've got a guy that has that game experience, a guy that's got some speed. He's put some good things on tape. A lot of schools need wide receivers, whether you're a new coaching staff, a coaching staff that's trying to find some needs to fill there. And again, options are a lot more limited in the spring as they were in the winter. So I think you've got a guy that we'll see what schools could potentially jump into the mix after he visits Florida, because Syracuse, he played his high school senior season out in California, but he's from Rochester, New York. So he moved out west from Rochester, New York. So he visited Syracuse, was there first. It's about an hour away from where he lives.
Okay.
But Florida was a team that, in his eyes, is recruiting him probably harder than anybody right now. They've got a dire need there at wide receiver. As far as having a room to where a guy that's got some experience and some production could jump in there and, if not start, could be in the heavy rotation there. So I think there are a lot of things to like about Florida. Facilities, I think if you compare those, Florida to Syracuse, I think you're going to give the edge there to Florida.
Sure.
So there are a lot of things to like. Billy Gonzalez has had a good coaching career of what he has put in the league and developed. So there are a lot of things to like about Florida, but I think in general, you need to get this guy around your coaching staff. You need to really lay everything out there in person and have that time around him. So I do think that Florida's in a really good spot. I think that things are trending their way, but you never know with the transfer portal. I mean, this is a guy that, again, has visited Syracuse. It's the transfer portal is probably one of the wildest things to cover just because there's a lot going on. It's a million miles an hour as far as covering these things. So I do think that Florida's in a good spot. I'm interested to see where this visit goes this weekend because I do think it could maybe cause some separation between Florida and Syracuse. And then even that, I'm wondering, how long will he continue to take things out? Because, again, Syracuse hosted him on campus this past weekend for an official visit, and here we are on Tuesday, and he's not committed to Syracuse. So did they miss the boat by him taking the extra time? He's going to Florida this weekend. Could they pounce on that? Is there an extended time to where how far away does he get from that Florida visit? Does he commit on the visit? Does he commit a couple of days later? Who else will pop in? So there's a lot of things there, but I do think Florida is in a good spot.
Okay, another name that I have seen Gator fans talk about on social media is Jason Zandamela. And, he jumped in the portal from USC, offensive lineman. UCF is hot and heavy on him. Is this a situation that Florida might be interested, or do you think that, kind of being limited by our scholarship count, and I think maybe being a little bit pleasantly surprised with the offensive line coupled with the reclassification where there just isn't room?
I would say all of the above. I think that there is genuine interest in Florida because you've got a guy that I believe was ranked. I know he's ranked a 4-star. I don't have his ranking up in front of me, but I believe he was like the number 1 ranked center, or he was a highly ranked interior offensive lineman, however you want to paint that. So that's a young guy that's going to have – this isn't a 1-year rental guy. This is the guy that you would have multiple years there. He's already got the talent as it is. So anytime you can add a big-time player like that at any position in the portal, I think that that's one you go to. But I also think at the same time, Florida's crunching the numbers. You really want to add an offensive lineman, add a wide receiver to the roster there that can be ready to play this coming season. Jason Zandamela was a freshman at USC this past season. I don't believe he got much, if any, game experience there. And it's not to say he's not talented. He just doesn't have the experience. So if you're putting a gun to my head, and I'm not the head coach. Billy Napier and all these coach staffs know more about football and coaching in one little finger than I do in my entire body. But if it's me, I'm picking the wide receiver that can play now as opposed to a guy that could be an interior guy that may or may not be able to make an impact this season. So I think that the numbers crunch is something that's factoring in there. I do think that Florida is pretty happy where they are on the offensive line, but I think that in general, that is where you're at from your starting 5 to guys that you know that you're going to be able to rotate in there, that are going to be able to get some burn. Guys that you saw get a lot of game snaps throughout spring football practice. I know they were hampered with a little bit of injuries there as far as some of the starters. Mm-hmm. So I do think that they are pretty pleased with their offensive line in general. I think it's one of those deals to where in the portal, if you can add a guy that can help your team now or in the long run or however you want to paint it, like that's an area where you're going to make a move and you're going to proceed forward. But I do think the numbers in general have to work themselves out because you need to add a wide receiver there. Could you potentially find some way somehow to add a second wide receiver? I mean, that's something I guess we'll see where things go there because, again, I could see an area where Florida would need to add to. You've
Yeah.
got some of those unproven guys in there. So if you have a chance to do that, Justice Ross Simmons is probably the only guy that I'm tracking right now at that wide receiver position. But I do think Zanamella is a guy that they really like, and they have been recruiting, and they're talking with him and his people about potentially hosting him on a visit, whether that be this weekend or the early part of next week. So we'll see there. He's at UCF right now and will be there until Wednesday. So we'll see. But I do think that there is legitimate interest on both sides.
Blake, tell everybody where they can find your work, where they can follow you on social media. You've got all this great recruiting information, and people need to know where to find it.
Yeah, Swamp 24/7. It's the Florida Gators 24/7 sports site. Myself, Jacob Rudner, Graham Hall, we're all on there. I guess I'm not very cool and don't have a life because I spend a lot of time on there. I spend a lot of time talking recruiting because it is a 24/7 year-round thing that happens all the time, especially with the transfer portal that's going on right now. Recruiting never sleeps, and those guys do a good job covering the team, whether it's baseball, basketball, football, all of the above. So that's where I am on the 24/7 Sports Network. And then my Twitter is, or X or whatever we call it these days now, is @Blake_Alderman.
All right, guys, everybody give Blake a follow. Thanks for hanging out tonight. This was awesome. And I feel like I got some names to pay attention to now.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me on.